this computer, so someone should yell at me. I think that's Raina's job to yell at me if you can't hear me. So appreciate if you do that. I'm going to share my screen and get started here with the PowerPoint. Come on, there we go. So this is the San Juan Citizens Alliance Scoop, the Wildlife Program Update. As Raina said, my name is Gary Skiba. I'm the Wildlife Program Manager. And our addresses, email addresses at the Alliance are all same format, first name at sanjuancitizens.org. So if you want to get in touch with me, please go ahead and do so. So what I'm going to do today is talk some about wolves and some about bighorn sheep and a few other odds and ends along the way. So when it comes to wolves, the topics I'm going to touch on tonight are the wolf relisting, which I'm sure you've all heard about, that a federal judge ruled that the Fish and Wildlife Service inappropriately delisted wolves. That took effect about a year ago, and this is now, they have been relisted. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The Stakeholder Advisory Group, which I'm a member of, is one of the groups that Colorado Parks and Wildlife put together to help design the wolf management plan that was required by Proposition 114, which passed about, that's 2 years ago, a year and a half ago now, not 14 months ago. So, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Southwest Colorado Wolf Cooperative, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, and the depredations that have been occurring in North Park, or that did occur earlier this year. So first on relisting, this was a decision from the district court in California. And as I said, what Judge White said was that the Fish and Wildlife Service inappropriately applied the requirements of the Endangered Species Act when they delisted wolves. And that was a process that went on for quite a few years, actually. The original proposal to delist wolves started in the Obama administration and worked its all the way through and was completed in the Trump administration. And then, as I said, took effect just about a year ago. The implications of the delist or the relisting are unclear at this point. I think that's the best way to put it. There's a lot of action going on in the background between CPW and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because the question is, how does that affect the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado? And the one thing we know is that as long as wolves are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife will have to get some sort of permit or authorization from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in order to move wolves into Colorado. So how that's going to work is not known yet, and just exactly what they will do and how they will do it is pretty unclear. The other part of it too is that CPW just a month ago passed a hazing regulation, which allowed ranchers or anybody that protecting livestock to use certain techniques to keep wolves away from livestock. And those included a number of things that probably are still allowed under the federal law and some that certainly are not allowed. So for example, fladry is flags that are hung on a wire and around a pasture, for example. And for some reason, these flags, which are just strips of cloth, wolves are bothered by those. They won't go through fladry typically. Eventually, they learn that it's not an issue, but they avoid it at first and will not go through a fence that has fladry on it. So that's being used now and is probably okay under the federal regulation. But the CPW regulation also allowed for things like rubber bullets and rubber buckshot and chasing animals with vehicles. And it's likely that some of those are not authorized or not allowable under the federal law. So that's something that CPW is working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right now to understand. The longer term part of this is that, as I said, in order for CPW to reintroduce wolves to Colorado, they'll need some authorization from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's going to require a NEPA process, National Environmental Policy Act. So they will have to do an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement in order to issue some sort of permit or rule that will allow CPW to restore wolves to Colorado. How that's going to play out, we don't know at this point. I am a member of the Stakeholder Advisory Group. This is a group of one of two groups created by CPW to help create the wolf management plan. Again, the ballot initiative passed in November of 2020, and that required CPW to reintroduce wolves to Colorado by the end of 2023. So a little bit, just about a year and almost 2 years from now. They have to have wolves on the ground per the law that was created by the ballot initiative. So the question now is how are we going to do that? That was the question it created, and CPW put these two groups together. The other one is the technical working group, and there are people who really dislike the acronyms because we call the technical working group the TWIG and the stakeholder group the SAG, and people find those offensive for some reason in some way. But at any rate, those are the two groups. The SAG is composed of 17 members, and it's across the entire spectrum of interests or viewpoints on wolves and wolf restoration. So there are a number of ranchers on it. There are a number of wolf advocates who've worked for nonprofits who have been focusing on wolf restoration in Colorado for years. So it does have that entire spectrum. And in some ways, it's similar to the group that was put together back in 2004. At that time, I worked for the Colorado Division of Wildlife. This was before it became Parks and Wildlife. And we created a wolf management plan at that point to address wolves that might migrate into Colorado. And that's all it really addressed. It was not a reintroduction plan. It was just, what are we going to do if wolves show up? How are we going to manage them? And so that was the purpose of that. And our executive director, Mark Pearson, who's on this call tonight, was a member of that group. And again, similar to the SAG, it was had a spectrum of interests on that particular working group. Similar, it was somewhat smaller than the SAG is today, but it had the same sort of range of interests about wolves. So the SAG has been meeting monthly for about a year now, and I guess it was June was our first meeting, June of last year, so about 8-9 months now. And we have monthly meetings, and we recently have started to do interim meetings between our monthly meetings of subgroups to address some of the issues. So there's been actually quite a bit of work involved in getting the recommendations that the SAG will make to CPW for wolf management. Our focus at the beginning, and that has been the main focus until just about a month ago, has been on a compensation program. And this is compensation for losses of livestock to wolves. And that program, a compensation program, is required by the ballot initiative. When wolf advocates who promoted the ballot initiative wrote that initiative, they said, we are going to find a way to compensate ranchers for losses of livestock to wolves. So that has been the main focus, and as I said, until about a month ago. They said required by the statutes. The next thing that we started in on was conflict reduction, which is how do you prevent depredation by wolves on livestock to begin with? And everyone is on the same page on this. Everybody feels that it's better to prevent than to pay compensation, but we are going to do both, and we are in the midst of developing the outlines of our conflict reduction program now. So, and that's going to include things like I mentioned, flattery is a way that you can keep wolves from attacking livestock. Range riders, which are people who stay with the wolves, it's just human presence, and they don't have to be riders in the sense of horseback riders, but they have to be out there with the wolves, with the livestock to prevent the wolves coming in. There are different noise devices and light devices that can be used also to prevent wolves or to deter wolves from coming into livestock. So all those things are part of conflict reduction, and that's something that we're focusing on now as part of the stakeholder advisory group. The next thing we're going to shift into is management of wolves. And this is where things are going to get kind of interesting, would be a fair way to put it. Management includes questions like the number of wolves, and that's the number both for delisting under Colorado's endangered species law. So Colorado now has wolves listed as a state endangered species, and they have been for about 40 years. So that is still in place, even though the federal listing is also on top of that. So the federal listing is the penalties for take of a wolf, if you were to illegally kill a wolf, are much greater under the federal act than they are under the Colorado Act, but both do protect the wolves right now. So at some point, the intent is if wolves become numerous enough that they would be taken off the state endangered species list. And so part of our task with the stakeholder group is to make a recommendation about what that means in terms of numbers, distribution of wolves, and just how you would determine when that happens, when you can delist it. There's also is a push to look at different management techniques, and really what this is coming down to is lethal control of wolves. So at what point, how many wolves does it take that you have in Colorado, a Colorado population, to where you can start to use lethal control as a tool on a regular basis? So that's going to be one of the other things discussed. Another one is going to be a maximum number or cap on the number of wolves in Colorado. That's one that I know that I will be opposing, in the sense of there is no way to determine a maximum number of wolves. The issue that you're addressing with wolves in Colorado is going to be reducing or the level of conflict. So if you have 10 wolves and they're constantly killing livestock, you have a different situation that requires some management. If you have 1,000 wolves and not killing any livestock, there's no need to have. You just can't establish a cap or a maximum number at this point, because we don't know how much conflict there's going to be. As I mentioned, lethal control is one of the issues that's going to come up under this management discussion, and when lethal control is appropriate. Every state that has wolves has some level of lethal control. There are times when it does seem to be the only alternative to wolves that do start to regularly kill livestock, and that's generally the issue, livestock deaths. That control can be by agency personnel, which is very targeted. You identify the animals that are the ones causing the problem, and those are the animals that you take out. There's also going to be a push to have recreational hunting, which is another thing that I know I'll be opposing. Recreational hunting has not proven anywhere that it's been implemented to reduce depredation by wolves. There's some evidence that has a very slight effect, but it's just not targeted to the animals that are the problem, and so therefore it doesn't really cause a decline in depredation. And there's some evidence that because of the social structure of wolves, if you take animals out of a pack, you can actually increase the level of depredation on livestock, because you have, for example, if you take out the alpha animals, you end up with younger animals that really don't know what they're doing, and they end up killing more livestock as a result. So those are the issues that we'll see with the management plan part, or the management issues with wolves. Next thing, just briefly wanted to talk about, is the Southwest Colorado Wolf Cooperative. This is a group that started out of the 2018 Wolf Symposium that was held here in Durango. And the initial focus of that group was on working with ranchers and trying to develop a dialogue with ranchers around wolves and wolf management. That kind of fell apart a little bit because of the election results. Some of the people in the ranching community were very upset about the result of the election and the fact that the ballot initiative passed. And then COVID came along within a few months after that and really kind of squashed everything. So we have not been able to meet with that group and do anything in the particular issue of wolf rancher coexistence. So now what we're focusing on is we're moving our focus to public education with the Southwest Wolf Cooperative. This group has been fairly informal, but we're getting kind of a little more formal and starting to develop some specific goals on public education. We'll be moving forward with that. The Rocky Mountain Wolf Project was the entity that was behind the ballot initiative from the start. And that group now has changed to where there's a small group of advisors. There are 5, and I'm one of those advisors to the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. And we are focused on several things. We're looking at developing a license plate, a Colorado special license plate, where the contributions to the plate will be used for non-lethal conflict reduction. So some of those techniques I talked about, like fladry, range riders, some of the lights and noise devices that we would help to make available to ranchers so they could, so we prevent the loss of wolves and prevent the loss of livestock. We want to prevent both. We also are trying to assist with funding in North Park. Unfortunately, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, because of the role that we had in passing the ballot initiative, is not exactly viewed as a friend by most of people in the ranching community. And some of them have said they don't want our money. So we're finding other ways to work both with CPW, Wildlife Services, the federal agency, to use the funds that we do have. And if we get the license plate funding, in order to, we're finding ways to use those funds to prevent wolf loss and prevent livestock loss. So the North Park depredations, this was a very unfortunate set of circumstances. Since mid-December and into mid-January, 3 cows and 2 dogs were killed. A couple others were injured, both cattle and dogs. As I said, that was from the middle of December roughly to the middle of January. And there haven't been any recent depredations, but there has been a lot of activity in North Park with wolf advocates visiting North Park to help prevent depredation. So there are people who are out all night on the particular ranch that suffered most of the losses. And they're sitting out there watching for wolves and trying to keep wolves away from the livestock. They haven't seen any wolves recently, and they have erected some fladry around the pasture that the cattle are in now. And so it appears that the depredations have stopped for now, but that doesn't mean they'll stay stopped. So people are continuing to focus on that area and try to prevent any further cattle depredations. So overall, the goals that I've had with wolf management in Colorado and the role that I'm going to play with the Alliance is, first of all, to ensure that CPW meets the requirement of putting wolves on the ground, paws on the ground by the end of 2023. And as I said, with the federal relisting of wolves, that has become a lot more complicated. And the pressure needs to be kept on CPW to keep them pushing forward with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to get the necessary authorization to bring wolves into Colorado by the end of 2023. And CPW, through the planning process, has said that their goal was to have the plan in place by the summer of 2023 so that they could do the first transplants, first relocations by the end of 2023. The window for moving wolves is typically sometime in November through March. So just into the breeding season for wolves. That's when the best time is to relocate wolves, and that's when the goal is. So for CPW, the way they've structured this, they're going to have a couple of months at the end of 2023 to move wolves into Colorado. The other thing that I'm focused on is creating a strong conflict prevention program. That's part of what we're doing on the SAG, and that one needs to be strong both in the sense of having lots of different techniques available to ranchers, having training for ranchers and other livestock producers so that they know how to use the techniques, and providing the technical assistance that they need, which can be provided through Colorado Parks and Wildlife and also through Wildlife Services, the federal agency, and through the efforts of some nonprofits who've done this sort of thing already. One of those in particular is Working Circle, which has worked with ranchers in California and in Montana to create programs where people learn how to prevent wolf livestock conflicts. And also, one of the goals that I have is to prevent a recreational hunting season. As I said, I don't see any reason why there's a need for a recreational hunting season. It doesn't do anything as far as population management of wolves or preventing conflict. And frankly, the only reason to have a recreational hunting season is because someone wants to kill a wolf. There's no management reason beyond that to have a recreational hunting season. And I mentioned the cap on numbers. There's no biological reasoning that can be used to establish a cap at the beginning of the planning process, because we don't know how much conflict there's going to be. And the focus then that I'm trying to bring to the stakeholder group is that we need to have that focus on conflict and not just on numbers in some way. We have no way of establishing a number that's good, bad, or indifferent until we know how much conflict there is. So now I'm going to move on to Bighorn sheep, and I'll give you a brief history and talk about the big issue with Bighorn sheep, and then talk about what to do about that. So one of the things about bighorns that people don't even recognize is that bighorns were probably our most common ungulate, a hoofed animal, when Europeans arrived in Colorado. There were bighorns everywhere. And one of the things that I always talk about is that those of you who are aficionados of petroglyphs, if you look at the petroglyphs, like the ones that are behind me in my on my Zoom photo here, you always see bighorn petroglyphs. You rarely see elk and deer petroglyphs. You'll see some, but bighorn petroglyphs are far more common. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a good estimate of the population size, but I think it does say something about how common those animals were. And if you look up and down the Animas River, for example, there used to be bighorns all the way down into New Mexico. Anywhere where there was cliffy habitat, there were bighorn sheep. And they now occupy a small portion of that range. In Colorado in 1900, after a lot of market hunting and some disease issues, there were about 7,300 bighorn sheep in the state by the estimates of Colorado Parks and Wildlife, Colorado Division of Wildlife. In 1970, that had dropped to 2,200 sheep for various reasons. CPW, or at that time it was DOW, the Division of Wildlife, began an intensive trapping and transplanting and disease treatment and habitat manipulation program. And through that effort, it brought the sheep population, the bighorn sheep population today to about 7,000. So we're back at where we were in 1900 through an intensive program of work on bighorn sheep. So, and right now we have about 1/3 of the habitat for bighorn sheep occupied, and this is based on modeling that CPW has done. So we know that we can have far more bighorn sheep in Colorado. The habitat's there. So what's the problem? Well, the big problem is disease. And the diseases that are of concern for bighorn sheep are transmitted typically from domestic sheep to bighorn sheep. They can be transmitted by goats as well, domestic goats, but the main source is domestic sheep. And domestic sheep almost always have a particular organism, a particular bacterium that can cause major problems for bighorn sheep. And those die-offs in sheep can be devastating in bighorns. In 2019, there was a die-off on the National Bison Range in Montana, which resulted in 85% mortality of all the sheep. But the long-term effects and the most insidious part of the diseases is that they have a long-term effect on lamb survival. So the ewes, the female sheep, bighorn sheep, can be carrying this bacterium that causes lamb survival to drop. And so you end up with these stagnant populations of bighorn sheep that just don't seem to be able to expand or to grow in numbers. And the only way we know of to keep the diseases from being transmitted is to separate the two species. So there is no vaccine, there's no treatment that you can use for bighorn sheep to prevent them from getting this particular disease. And that separation, the minimum that's been recommended by wildlife biologists is 9 miles between bighorns and domestic sheep. One of the things that happens, and one of the places where we can influence things, is through National Environmental Policy Act analysis on federal lands, basically U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management lands, where they're looking at the grazing allotments and reevaluating whether they should continue to graze animals there. And one of the options for that is to close allotments. And that's one of them. The other one is to buy out allotments, which the National Wildlife Federation has worked on specifically and has bought out some allotments, including some up in the Weminuche Wilderness. So I got a little ahead of myself there with my slides. This is some of the other things that I've been working on. I made comments to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. As you know, the commission is a governor-appointed body that sets policy for the agency. And I made comments to them on January 12th. The basis of those comments was that some of these allotments should be closed. And as you go through these NEPA processes, and that CPW should be making that recommendation. So we engaged our membership in comments to the commission. I got great help from Great Old Broads for Wilderness, Rocky Mountain Bighorn Society, and Dan Parkinson, who's on this call, or at least was. And what we're doing is we're also pushing to get the Forest Service to move forward with a grazing analysis in the Weminuche Wilderness that they began back in 2012. And that one has stalled out for various reasons. And Mark Pearson and I met with the Forest Service supervisor, the forest supervisor here in Durango, and asked that they move that forward if they can. So we're going to keep that pressure on. So my goals for working on bighorn sheep are, first of all, we want to increase the state's bighorn population and enhance public recognition of the status of bighorns and the threat of disease from domestic sheep to bighorn sheep, and get CPW to more aggressively manage bighorns, which includes them making recommendations to the federal agencies that certain allotments that are of high risk to bighorns due to disease transmission be closed. And that's where that push is right now, and we're continuing to work on that issue. Now, there's some odds and ends I wanted to talk about that I've been working on. One of those is biological surveys in the HD Mountains between Bayfield and Pagosa Springs. The Forest Service has a number of projects going on there, mainly oil and gas, but also some vegetation management projects. And they frankly don't have very good biological information, whether that's bird distribution or the distribution of reptiles and amphibians. Bats are a major hole in what they know and don't know. And so we have been doing surveys, and we are going to continue to do those this coming summer, this coming field season, to try to get better information so that we can more effectively comment about the processes that are going on there. So that, as I said, get better information. And I'm also trying to work on New Mexico issues. You know, the San Juan Citizens Alliance is very active in oil and gas issues in Northwest New Mexico, but wildlife issues have not been as prominent for our organization, partly because we haven't had a wildlife presence as such. So I'm working on that a little bit and just getting more engaged. And I have gotten to work with the BLM office in Farmington on some oil and gas issues that have impacted wildlife, and trying to provide a little bit of background, a little bit of comment on those processes so that we are sure that the wildlife issues are being addressed. I'm also a member of the La Plata County Living with Wildlife Advisory Board. This is a group that advises the county commissioners on wildlife issues. And right now we're working on deer, what we've been calling urban deer, and that includes both deer in the confines of Durango, but also in a lot of the subdivisions that are in the county where there's a lot more interaction between people and pets and deer. So there are issues there, especially during the rut when buck deer can get pretty aggressive towards dogs and to people sometimes. We're also working on dogs on leash in the county, and that's been an issue for a long time. There is a leash law in Durango, but there is not one in the county, and there is a push to have a leash law in the county. And then also mountain lions, and the issue with mountain lions is more again in the confines of Durango, and also in some of the subdivisions in the county where lions follow deer into the subdivision and can also threaten pets and potentially people within those areas. I'm working with the bear working group. Brian Peterson, I think, is on the call. Brian's been the leader of that group for quite some time, doing great work on trying to reduce conflict between bears and people within La Plata County. And right now that group is going to be working on a grant application to CPW for $1 million that they have available to help reduce bear conflict across the state. So those are some of the other odds and ends. And my goals overall as the wildlife program manager for the San Juan Citizens Alliance are to keep us active and involved in these wildlife issues. We just haven't had the staff to do that. Since I've been on, I've been able to focus entirely on wildlife issues, and thus our presence is a lot more notable now in the wildlife area. And my background is as an agency person, so I try to provide a really balanced approach to things as far as understanding where the agencies are at, what they can and can't do, and trying to make reasonable recommendations to them, but keeping the heat on so that they do their job in the way they're supposed to. And I believe that's where I'm going to end, and I will be happy to answer any questions. I baffled everybody. They have no questions.
Well, I guess I have one, Gary. I'll jump in.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, that was an excellent presentation, really well thought out, cohesive, and spot on. So thanks. You had mentioned there was a previous group with DOW. Was that a SAG group or TWIG?
It was essentially the same as, well, it was kind of a combination at that point because we did have technical advisors. There wasn't a specific technical group as such. So the wolf working group was mainly, well, it was composed of a couple of wildlife biologists, a couple of ranchers, a few wolf advocates. So it was the same kind of spectrum. And we did also have, as I said, technical advice from wolf biologists because, there aren't very many wolf biologists in Colorado because we haven't had wolves for a long time. So we were consulting with people in other states who did work with wolves. So we did have that whole, the entire spectrum there, but it was closer to what the stakeholder group is now than it was not a technical working group as such. So it was a little bit of a mix, but closer to a stakeholder group. And by the way, Brian, thank you for the kind words about the presentation. I appreciate that.
Oh yeah. I guess my question there was there a plan in case wolves repopulated Colorado on their own to mitigate conflict with ranchers?
Well,
it seems like the North Park area really caught everybody off guard.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment because it shouldn't have. I mean, we had a pack of wolves. We had 6 young wolves there. And the fact that CPW in particular or Wildlife Services wasn't really prepared to deal with that is a little bit concerning. That was to be expected, at least that there could be conflict and be prepared for the potential conflict. But back to your question about the group and what they did, the plan really focused only on wolves migrating into Colorado and how we would deal with them. And the key thing that came out of that group and the key recommendation was that wolves should be allowed to live wherever they want to live in Colorado as long as they're not causing problems. And if they are causing problems, you deal with the problems. And that was really the guts of that plan. And it was to address only individuals that were migrating in. And it's interesting, the first wolf that we knew in Colorado that had migrated in was killed on I-70 about a month after we started the working group. So they were starting to come in. There were a few individuals. But again, that focused only on migrating wolves, no plans to have a population goal, no plans to reintroduce wolves. So it's just how do you address the wolves that come in on their own as they start to repopulate Colorado, if they did. And at that point, we really didn't know if they were going to. We just assumed that they might. So does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, perfectly. And I have another one. I don't want to hog this, but you had mentioned that the group that pushed for the wolf reintroduction had as a goal to have funding available to compensate ranchers. Are they responsible for coming up with that money, or is their funding sources coming from elsewhere?
No, they are not. The Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, essentially the legislature is. I mean, the law says that the state will fund programs or will create programs for compensation for loss of livestock and conflict prevention. So that is on the plate of the legislature. And the legislature last year appropriated $1.1 million of general fund dollars, tax dollars, to CPW for wolf management. So that money is currently being used for the planning process, which, the way the planning process is working is CPW hired a contractor, and the total cost of that contract for the life of the contract is almost $500,000. So about half of the funds that the legislature allocated went to that contract immediately. The rest of the funds can be used for anything from paying personnel who are working on wolf restoration to purchasing materials like fladry or other prevention materials for wolves. So that's still in process, but as I said, half the money is already to the contractor. Then the expectation is that just the way the process works is that there will be at least another 1.1 million for the next fiscal year, which starts in July. That's when the state fiscal year starts. So I think there were a couple of questions in the chat there. I didn't really catch them, Raina. I don't know if you can do that and let me know what they are.
Sure, we have a few. The first is from Dave Jones, and he asked, What are the effective ways to influence CPW and the commission regarding the 2023 deadline for wolf reintroduction?
Well, you need to call them, email them, call them, go to, comment at commission meetings. Every commission meeting has the opportunity for public comment. And I think it would be great if we could get a bunch of people there to just say, you realize you're in a different situation now with the federal relisting. You need to get on the stick and figure out what you need to do, get a schedule put into place for every step of the process and make sure that it happens. That's, because otherwise the alternative is that what's going to happen is that if CPW, due to the federal listing, is not able to get wolves on the ground because they haven't gone through the process of getting the federal permissions, the legislature is going to have to reopen the law that was created by the ballot initiative, and nobody knows what would happen then. I mean, the one thing they would have to do in order to keep CPW from violating the law is to change the deadline from the end of 2023. But if you open up anything, you know how that goes with the legislative issues, they could do just about anything to the law that was created by the ballot initiative. But to Dave's point, yes, contact the commission. You can get on the CPW website. You can email the commission. As I said, the commission meetings, everything is available for public comment. You can comment at any meeting. They always have a section on wolf restoration because that's been one of the big issues the commission's been dealing with. So there's the opportunity to comment specifically on the wolf issue. And just that's something that everybody needs to hammer home, is that in order for CPW to meet the law, they need to get the federal permissions in place as soon as possible.
Okay, great. And our next question is from Gwen, and she said, great presentation, fascinated to learn about the folks working to keep wolves from predating, I read that wrong, on livestock at night in northern Colorado. What are areas for reintroduction in Colorado? Northwest Colorado is so wild and remote, and it makes sense they migrated there.
So Gwen, are you asking specifically what sites, where would wolves be reintroduced? Is that the question? I'm going to assume that's the question, Gwen.
Yeah, that's the question, Gary. Sorry, I couldn't figure out mute.
I know how that goes. So yeah, thanks. Well, we don't know yet. There has been, as I mentioned, there are two groups. There's a technical working group, and the technical working group has commented that, well, first of all, there's different ways you can release wolves, and they did both of these techniques in the Northern Rockies when they restored wolves there. One of them is what's called a soft release, is where you put wolves in pens and keep them there for about 90 days and then release them. And they tend to stay fairly close. Not always very close, but fairly close. The other technique is called a hard release, where you just bring the wolves from wherever you catch them, just take them out and dump them into the woods immediately. So there's no sort of acclimation period there, and those wolves tend to move further. And the recommendation from the technical working group was that the hard releases, just because of the cost and because of the, we know that it's successful, it was very successful in Idaho, that's the way to go. And if you do that, the average distance that those wolves moved was about 60 miles. So the recommendation from the technical working group was to have the releases all be at least 60 miles from a state boundary, so that we're not putting wolves into Utah or New Mexico or Wyoming. And if we do that, that really, given the other part of the ballot initiative, which said the wolves could only be released on the western slope, that really ratchets things down. And it's a lot of Gunnison County is where it ends up. So if we follow those criteria, which has not been decided, but that's the recommendation of the technical working group, if you follow those, it's going to be there in central Colorado and kind of, as I said, centered on Gunnison County. But if not, there are plenty of places that are adequate wolf habitat across the entire western slope that can support wolves. And you mentioned that Northwest Colorado is pretty wild, but you look across the world and there are plenty of places where there are high densities of humans and high densities of wolves. So we know that people and wolves can live together at relatively high densities, higher densities than we expect to see in Colorado. So there's plenty of good wolf habitat, and really good wolf habitat comes down to having things to eat, which we have plenty of with elk and deer, and people leaving them alone.
Thanks, Gary.
And our next question is from Bradley, and he said, is NWF the only group buying out domestic sheep allotment? Are they only doing this in Colorado?
As far as I know, they're the only group doing it. Other groups have contributed to it, but NWF is doing it. And that's partly because they have a reputation as being kind of a middle of the road or centrist kind of organization. So that's part of it. They can work with ranchers a little more easily than some of the other groups. And they are working across the entire Western United States. So there have been buyouts in Wyoming and Montana, and they're focused on others. They are looking at some others in Colorado at this point, but nothing's really firm yet. But they are working across the West.
Awesome. Next question from Gwen. Is Defenders of Wildlife still compensating ranchers in Montana for grizzly depredation?
No, they're not. They have gotten out of that program, and so they're not doing it anymore. There is a state program that compensates, especially in Montana. The Montana Livestock Loss Board does compensate ranchers for losses to grizzlies and wolves.
Awesome. And next question from Brian Peterson. Could a new governor or administration in Colorado halt wolf reintroduction? And does CPW want more bighorns?
Two different questions.
Two questions.
The first one is the administration couldn't do it directly because it's state law right now. So when the ballot initiative was passed, it created state law, just as if the legislature had done it. So essentially, the voters of Colorado served as legislators to do that. So they created a state law. The only way to change that would be to change the state law. Now, there are ways that they could slow things down and make things more difficult. But as far as changing the requirements of law, they can't. The administration or the governor cannot do that on their own. And then as far as bighorns, I'm sure that CPW does want or would like to see more bighorns if they could. The response to the comments that I made about recommending the closure of allotments was, well, we're not in the business of putting ranchers out of business. And that's not what we were saying at all. But what we were saying is they should be making strong recommendations that protect bighorn sheep to the maximum extent possible. And overall CPW, I'm sure, would love to have more bighorns if they could do it in a way that they felt was, met their, where they didn't really get crossways with the agricultural industry.
Great. And that is what we have for questions in the chat.
Gary, this is Dan Parkinson. Just a couple of quick comments. First of all, a special thanks to Gary for being willing to go before the commission in a very timely manner. For folks that aren't up on what's happening with bighorns in Southwest Colorado, really the eyes of the bighorn world are on Southwest Colorado because of the proximity of bighorns to domestic sheep in Southwest Colorado, particularly in the Alpine Triangle region up by Silverton and Ouray. There are bighorns that are right on top of domestic sheep allotments. I should say there's domestic sheep allotments right on top of historic bighorn and active bighorn areas. And so in terms of the greatest risk to bighorns in the Western United States, there's probably no better example of that than what's happening in Southwest Colorado. And CPW did a great job of showing with considerable amount of data that there's a high likelihood for commingling, for the potential for disease transmission. And yet, because of a kind of historic and an MOU agreement, they didn't march the ball down the field and score the touchdown. They took a knee right on the 1 yard line and did not make a strong recommendation to close these allotments. And so Gary's request before the commission was really spot on and very timely, because there's virtually no other state organizations that are recommending the closure of high-risk allotments either, because of the political nature of the situation. So to continue to put pressure on the commission is very important. We're just asking the commission to ask CPW to follow the science and make a science-based recommendation to close the allotments. And that can be a huge step, and one that could result in giving bighorns over time more elbow room, which is back to Brian's question about, does CPW want more bighorns? I think bighorns, and I think a lot of biologists feel this way too, is that they represent a reflection of the health and the interconnectivity of our wild public lands. So when we have robust bighorn populations with genetic diversity and the capability of actually having natural hybrid vigor of these herds, that is the goal. And what we're seeing right now with a lot of the transplant and relocation efforts is we have small herds of less than 100 animals that are isolated. They're not able to move across the landscape. And so this is a great opportunity. Southwest Colorado is a great place to have this happen. And I just can't thank Gary and San Juan Citizens Alliance enough for the work they're doing on this. It's very timely. It's right. It's spot on. Thank you.
And Dan tends to be a little bit humble. A lot of this would never have happened without Dan's hard work. He's just been a dynamo in getting things done on bighorn sheep in Southwest Colorado. So thank you, Dan.
You're welcome, of course.
One last question, Gary, from Kathleen Delzell. Gary, you were at the stakeholders meeting last night for the Northern San Juan Basin coal bed methane group. I couldn't hear everyone's comments. Did you or someone else say anything about the possible negative effect of Catamont's proposed expansion of the Pargan well plus the pipeline?
Well, I didn't. Mark was there also. Mark was actually in the room. I was on the phone. So Mark, I don't know if you have a comment on that. I couldn't hear some of the conversation as well, Kathleen.
Yeah, well, my only comment is that Kathleen was running the show basically over the phone because the Forest Service doesn't have a staffer who's really in place to talk about oil and gas stuff. So thanks, Kathleen, for being in charge of the meeting, even though you were from a distance. But there wasn't really any, because the Forest Service didn't have any staff there that knew what was happening. There wasn't really any real useful conversation about these proposed wells. So we'll just kind of have to follow up with that later.
Yeah, and the issue, if Jimbo had been able to be there, the issue for us is that that whole area where I live, and I didn't know about Spring Creek, but it's a what do they call it for the elk, Gary? It's the where the last animals elk to leave where I live in the HDs. It's the cows with their calves. We're like a nursery or something.
They call them production areas is what
Thank
the
you.
terminology is. Yeah.
And I thought that was mentioned, that down by Spring Creek, that environment for those, what do you call it, production, that existed down by Spring Creek. But thank you, Gary, for being, I know you were, I kind of lose track sometimes who was in the room and who was on the Zoom. Thank you for being there. And then to be able to hear you do this. I'm a landowner up there, by the way, and you're talking about ranchers. I'm a landowner. What's the chances some wolf pack? I'm always watching out for bears, lions, mountain lions, and I didn't want to have to think in the rest of my life that maybe wolves are wandering around me when I'm in my fields. What do you go with that one for human fear? If you want to touch on that a bit.
Well, sure. Yeah. I mean, in North America, there have been only 2 known instances in the last 100 years, and they've been fairly recent, where people have been killed by what we think are healthy wolves. And so there was one in Saskatchewan and one in Alaska. Worldwide, wolves do occasionally kill people, but when you look at the numbers and you look at mountain lions, bears, and wolves, wolves tend to be shy towards people, whereas lions are ambush predators, and especially children have been killed by mountain lions. And it's I mean, personally, I have no fear of wolves in the wild. I wouldn't say I fear lions, but I'm aware about lions and think about whether lions are out there and around. I mean, I think they're more of a concern. So, you're more likely to be killed driving your car to Safeway than you are to getting attacked by a wolf.
And I missed one question, but from Gwen.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll talk to Gary. Gary, I'll ask you some questions sometimes. Thank you so much.
You're
And
very
please, you've
welcome.
got Gwen. Anyway, Gwen got her all this stuff started, right? Gwen, go for it. It's your turn. I'm putting myself on mute, and adios.
Awesome, thank you. So Gwen asked, is the sheep industry increasing, declining, or staying steady in Southwest Colorado?
And Gwen, I'm sure you're meaning the domestic sheep industry. And, overall it's declining. That's pretty clear. And when you talk to the sheep producers, when they are feeling like they can share, it's pretty clear that most of them see the industry as going away, that it's slowly declining, and in some cases rapidly declining. It's one of the reasons why the buyouts are effective, why they can be effective, is because a lot of the producers, as many agricultural producers or livestock producers, it's just difficult to make a living at it to start with. And any changes, whether it's increased recreation, where people are interacting with domestic sheep and the guard dogs, and there are issues there. There are issues with ATVs in the high country and the areas where those are allowed. And so they just see a lot of problems or increasing problems, and they're not increasing their profits in any way. So overall, it's pretty clear that the industry is declining. And in a certain sense, we're in a good position from a conservation standpoint because we're in this process of a declining industry, and we can take advantage of that.
Great, well, that's all from the chat. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Thank everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here and for your attention and for the great questions. So I really appreciate it. And if there is anything that comes up on the wildlife end of things, like Kathleen apparently is going to bend my ear on a few things, feel free, please. I love talking to everybody about the issues that I'm dealing with, and would love to help you in any way I can. So thank you.
All right, thank you all.